Day 16. Jake awakened with Bo laying on his left side, snuggled up next to him. Jake was laying on his back, and he felt Bo's erect penis press up against the outside of his right thigh. Bo's hand was laying atop Jake's underwear in his crotch. Bo snored lightly, so Jake knew he had done this in his sleep, or at least that is what he suspected. Jake removed Bo's hand from his crotch and laid it on Bo's right side. He carefully climbed out from underneath the sheets and blanket and got dressed. He put the same sweatpants on he had worn yesterday. He didn't see any need to dirty another pair of pants if they were going to ramble through the woods again today. He made his way over to his pile of clothes beside the chest and found a dark blue t-shirt and put it on. He sat back down on the edge of the bed and put his socks and shoes on before he walked to the bathroom to pee. After he took care of his business, he made his way downstairs. Jake assumed Brian and Marissa were already up because the lights were on in the kitchen and he could hear them as they talked softly. Jeannie met him at the bottom of the stairs and followed him into the kitchen. While he made his way through the great room, he looked at the clock on the mantelpiece and it indicated it was 4:54 a.m. Brian and Marissa both said, "Good morning," when he walked into the kitchen and over to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning. Would you like some breakfast?" Marissa asked. "No, thank you. I'm just gonna have my usual." Jake stopped by the kitchen island to splash a little creamer into his coffee on his way to the front porch. Jeannie followed behind him. He turned the porch light on and opened the door and walked out onto the porch. He held the screen door open for Jeannie, and she walked out the door and made her way off the porch. She walked out near the edge of the driveway and did her business. When she finished, she came back upon the porch and laid down at Jake's feet just as he sat down. He asked, "Who's a good puppy?" Jeannie barked softly at him and wagged her tail. Jake continued to lean forward and pet Jeannie for a few more minutes. He then sat back in the chair and pulled a cigarette out of his near-empty last pack and lit it. He felt through the pack from the outside and counted 5 cigarettes. "Is Bo up and ready?" Brian asked as he stood at the screen door.
No.
"He was still sleeping when I came downstairs." "You should go upstairs and wake him because we'll need to get going in a little bit." "Okay, I'll go wake him." Brian turned around and went back inside the house. Jake set his coffee and cigarette down and went back inside and climbed the stairs up to the loft. He walked to the bedroom door and opened it to wake Bo and noticed that he quickly jerked the covers back over the top of himself. Jake smiled at him because he suspected what he was doing. Jake said, "We're gonna be leaving in a few minutes. I'll get dressed and be right down." Jake turned around and headed back downstairs and back out onto the porch. Jeannie still lay in the same spot. Jake had to step over her to sit back down. He thought to himself, "She is a really good dog." He picked his coffee back up and took a few sips. Then he picked his cigarette back up and took a few more drags off of it before he flipped the butt out into the yard. Brian came out and joined him on the porch and sat down on the bench. "Did you wake Bo?" "I did. He said he'll be down in a few minutes." "Good. I want to leave as soon as we can. Bo want to drink at least 1 cup of coffee before we leave. He should have enough time for that if he hurries up." "Did you hear any other creatures come around last night and look for the body of the dead Bigfoot?" Jake asked.
No.
"I suspect the reason for that is because I used the hose to wash away the blood and tissue out of the yard after you, and Bo went to bed last night." "That was a good idea. You don't want the stink to linger around here anyway," Jake said. Bo walked onto the porch as he carried a cup of coffee. He was dressed in his own pair of jeans and a green t-shirt he had borrowed from Steve. He sat down in the chair next to Jake and set his coffee down on the table so he could pet Jeannie. Brian asked Bo, "How'd you sleep?" With a smile on his face and a wink at Jake, Bo said, "Great." When Bo smiled and winked at Jake, Jake began to think, "When I woke up to Bo's hand in my crotch, it might not have been by accident. I felt something sticky on my right thigh when I got out of bed. Maybe I just imagined it. Maybe Bo smiled and winked at me because he suspects that I know what he was doing when I went back upstairs to wake him up. Maybe he knows that I caught him in the act." Brian said, "When you guys finish your coffee and wake up a little bit, we need to head out. I'm going after a second cup and I'll be right back," Jake said. Jake got back up and went back into the cabin to get another cup of coffee. He didn't notice the picnic basket or cooler that normally sat on the kitchen island when he poured another splash of creamer into his coffee. He looked over to the kitchen counter and didn't see them there either. Marissa said, "Brian has already loaded the picnic basket and cooler into the truck? How'd you know that's what I was looking for?" "I just had a hunch. I really appreciate what you've done for Bo and me. You're also a wonderful cook, and I really enjoy your delicious meals." "Thank you," Marissa said as she blushed. "I packed each of you another egg salad sandwich and apple fritter for lunch today." "Thank you. Your egg salad sandwiches are great." With his coffee in hand, he turned around and made his way back out to the porch. As he walked into the great room, Marissa said, "You guys be careful today." "We will," Jake said. Jake nearly ran into Bo, who was on his way to the kitchen to get another cup of coffee, just as he turned back around to head back to the porch after responding to Marissa. Jake walked back out to the porch and sat down. Bo returned a few seconds later and sat back down. "I'll soon be ready," Jake said as he lit another cigarette. "I've already put the cooler and picnic basket inside the truck," Brian said. "I also poured 2 5-gallon cans of gas into the truck. I keep about 10 5-gallon cans of gas in the garden shed at all times, so I'll never run out." Jake said, "It's a good idea to store extra gas because there's no gas stations within 10 to 15 miles of here." Jake and Bo finished their second cups of coffee and Jake finished his second cigarette. "Are you ready?" Jake asked as he glanced at Bo. "As ready as I'll ever be," Bo said as he yawned. "Let's go," Jake said as he glanced at Brian. Brian ushered Jeannie back inside the cabin and turned the porch light off and shouted, "Bye," before he closed the door. He met Bo and Jake at the Bronco. Brian had already turned it around in the driveway. He got in the truck and started the engine while Bo climbed into the back seat. Jake got in and closed the door and they took off. Along the way, Jake asked, "Do you think the creatures retrieved the body of the one I killed last night?" "I suppose so," Brian said. "The Bigfoot bodies have always disappeared from anywhere I've killed one and left it lay, usually within a day or so." Jake asked, "Besides the creatures you killed yesterday and the single one you shot the day before, how many have you killed?" Brian thought about the question for a few seconds and said, "I've killed 4 on and around my property over the past 3 years, plus the 2 I killed yesterday and the one the day before. I guess that would make a total of 7. I'm to the point I can't remember how many I've personally killed because I've lost count," Jake said. "If I had to guess, I imagine I've killed 7. "I've killed at least 7, Bo said. Brian said, 7 must be the magic number. There has to be a large breeding population of these creatures around this area," Jake said. "From what we've just talked about, between the 3 of us, we've killed a total of 21 creatures." "Wow," Brian said. "I would never have expected it to be so many." "I wouldn't have thought we'd killed that many either," Bo said. "For us to have killed that many adult creatures, they must have been in this area for a long time," Jake said and thought to himself, "This just further proves my theory about why my grandpa built the cabin like a fortress." They were on the last switchback of the main dirt road and their destination was 2 miles ahead. The sun just began to rise above the treetops. The clock on the dash indicated it was 6:39 a.m. Brian drove the next 2 miles and said, "I'm going to park the truck several yards farther down the road past where we parked yesterday. We can enter the tree line and make our way to the main trail instead of walking back down the road to the trailhead. The truck will be closer if we need to make a quick getaway." Jake and Bo couldn't argue with that. Brian pulled the truck into a wide spot along the side of the road opposite the mountain where they would begin their search. He put the Bronco in park and turned the ignition off. He hit the button under the dash to unlock the tailgate. They climbed out of the vehicle and Brian hit the button on his door to lock the passenger area of the truck. They made their way to the back of the Bronco. Brian was busy as he strapped on his gun belt, so Bo opened the tailgate. Bo and Jake got their weapons from out of the back along with a couple of extra handfuls of ammunition. Brian reached into the back end and picked up the flashlight and then closed the tailgate and double-checked to make sure his truck was locked before they headed across the road and made their way into the tree line. It was still considerably dark inside the tree line. The canopy blocked the overhead rays of the sun as it came up. They walked about 10 yards before they reached the main trail. They stopped while Brian looked up at the top of the mountain toward the ridge line. As far as I know, there's one cave along the trail about 2/3 of the way up. There's supposed to be 2 more caves at the top of the ridgeline. The one at the end is where the miners found their gold. They turned to their right and walked down the trail. Jake thought to himself, this trail meanders almost exactly like the trail on the other mountain did yesterday. If you could see both mountains on a map minus the trees, both mountains and trails would almost look like mirror images of each other. They walked about 500 yards before the trail switched back and started to ascend at the same 40-degree angle like the trail did yesterday. They made their way cautiously along the trail to the halfway point up the side of the mountain before they stopped to rest. They didn't notice any sign of the creatures on their initial ascent. They could barely make out the cave that stood on the switchback above them while they looked through the thick trees. The only thing Jake could see was little patches of sunshine that reflected off the beige-colored sandstone and limestone rocks that jutted out from the side of the mountain. While they rested, Brian said, "Listen, there's no normal forest sounds. I noticed that yesterday too," Bo said. "There were no squirrels, chipmunks, birds, or even insects buzzing around." Jake asked, "Would you want to hang out around here with all these monsters?" "No," Bo said. Jake said, "I didn't think so." Jake explained to Brian, "The lack of normal forest sounds is one of the first things I discovered when the creatures began to torment me and Steve, or when they venture into our immediate area. I've never put 2 and 2 together," Brian said. "But now that I think about it, you're right." Brian led the way, and they continued on for another 75 yards before the trail switched back to the left. The first cave sat about 10 yards on their right farther up the trail. Brian raised his hand to get Jake and Bo's attention and whispered, "We need to be extra quiet in this area." Brian led them to within 5 feet to the right of the cave opening, and they stopped. They listened for any noises that might come from inside the cave. They didn't hear anything. Like yesterday, Brian leveled his .44 and walked in front of the cave opening and flashed his light. Nothing. As Jake looked at the cave, he thought it looked on the smaller side. It was 10 feet wide by about 8 feet tall and about 8 feet deep. Brian walked inside the cave and came back out a few seconds later and whispered, "I didn't notice anything important." They continued on and made their way up the trail for another 175 yards before the trail switched back in the opposite direction that led them to the top of the ridgeline. The first of the 2 caves on the ridgeline sat about another 150 feet up the trail on the left. These caves also faced north like the ones on the other ridgeline they investigated yesterday. They made their way to within 10 feet of the first cave. They stopped on the left side of the cave, opening to listen for any sounds inside it. They didn't hear anything. Brian whispered, "The next cave is where the miners found their gold." They stepped in front of the cave opening and Brian shined his flashlight inside. From what they saw, the floor of the cave sloped downward for about 15 feet before it sloped upward again. The ceiling inside this cave made it impossible for them to judge the depth of this cave while they stood in front of the cave entrance. The entrance to this cave measured about 25 feet wide by about 8 feet tall. There were several extra large Bigfoot impressions that led into and back out of this cave entrance. Brian whispered, "These footprints look fresh, so I'm gonna have to be very careful when I walk back into this cave to check it out. Who knows how many creatures might be inside it." "Maybe we should all go inside and check this one out," Bo whispered. Brian whispered, "Nah, you guys stay here and stay alert." "We will," Jake whispered. "But if you need help, yell for us." Jake and Bo watched as Brian unsnapped his holster and removed his gun and carried it at his side while he walked into the cave. He made his way down the slope and climbed back up the other side. They watched as Brian and the beam from his flashlight faded into nothingness inside the cave. Jake and Bo waited for a few minutes. Bo said, "Brian might be in some kind of trouble. He's been in there for a while." They couldn't see him or the light from his flashlight. Jake said, "I'm gonna go and check on him." Just as Jake got the last word out of his mouth, an ear-shattering roar billowed from the cave entrance. They heard Brian fire off 4 successive rounds from his .44 Magnum. Then they heard dead silence. Jake and Bo ran inside the cave entrance and made it to the bottom of the slope before they saw Brian's flashlight beam bounce along on the ceiling. They looked up and saw Brian make his way down the slope from the other direction with his left arm wrapped around Steve's shoulders. Brian and Steve made their way to the bottom of the slope where Jake and Bo helped them make their way back up the other side and exit the cave. Except for his sneakers, Steve was naked and covered in mud from his head to his feet. He had several scratches on his upper chest and arms. He also had a large gash on the front of his left thigh, just above his knee. Steve looked like he had lost all hope. He looked dazed and confused. He looked like he thought he would have never escaped the Bigfoot. He was emaciated and dehydrated. He trembled and was weak. Bo took off his t-shirt and helped Steve wrap it around his waist and tie it into a knot so it wouldn't fall off. Bo shook Steve's hand and gave him a giant bear hug. When Bo had finished hugging Steve, Jake wrapped his arms around him to hug him and said, "Man, am I happy to see you." When Steve and Jake broke their embrace, Jake had to step back and wipe away the tears from his eyes. He was so overcome with joy he jumped up and down. He had his best friend and buddy back. "This rescue isn't over," Brian said. "We still need to make it back down off this mountain and to my truck. I'm sure the other creatures in the area heard me fire my gun, so they'll probably be on the lookout for us. Come on, we need to move quickly." All four of them made their way back down the trail. It was tough going because Steve was all banged up and sore. Steve couldn't move quite as quickly as Brian wanted him to, so Jake handed the 30 to Brian and picked Steve up and hefted him over his left shoulder. Steve cried out in pain. Jake said, "Let's get the fuck off this mountain and get the fuck out of here." They ran down the trail and made it halfway down the second switchback before Jake had to take a break and put Steve down and rest. His back and sides ached. Bo handed Jake the shotgun and hefted Steve over his right shoulder and said, "Come on." They looked in all directions while they made their way down the trail and back through the tree line to the road. They didn't see a single Bigfoot. At the road, Bo put Steve down and they walked the 300 feet or so back to Brian's truck. When they made it to the truck, Brian manually unlocked the tailgate and lowered it. He reached into the picnic basket and handed Steve an egg salad sandwich. Bo reached into the cooler and asked Steve, "Do you want a cola, a beer, or a bottle of water?" Steve cleared his throat and covered his mouth as he coughed a couple times and said, "A cola," in a weak and raspy voice. "That's a good choice because you need to get some sugar into your system," Jake said. "Make sure you eat and drink slowly because if you do it too fast, it'll make you sick." Jake got a couple of napkins out of the picnic basket and wet them with the water inside the cooler from the melted ice and handed them to Steve so he could wipe his face and hands off before he started to eat. Steve trembled badly and had a hard time as he unwrapped his sandwich. Jake unwrapped his sandwich for him and opened his soda, while Steve sat on the tailgate of the truck and ate. Brian unlocked the passenger area of the truck. Bo and Jake stowed their guns behind the back seat and put the extra .00 buck and bullets they took with them back into their respective boxes inside the plastic bin. Brian came back to the back end of the truck and stood guard with his .44 while Steve ate and drank his cola. When Steve finished his sandwich, he looked up and asked, "Is there any more?" They all laughed and Brian said, "Eat everything in the basket." Jake opened a bottle of water and handed it to Steve. Switch back and forth between the cola and the water until you start to rehydrate. If you consume too much sugar too quickly, it'll shock your system and that'll make you sick too. Bo and Jake asked Brian what had happened inside the cave while they waited for Steve to finish eating. Brian said, "When I made my way up the other side of the slope, the cave opened up into an approximate 25 by 25 feet square chamber. I shined my light all the way to the back of the cave and spotted a lone Bigfoot asleep near the back wall. When I shined my light to the right of the Bigfoot, that's when I spotted Steve as he sat Indian style with his back to the wall in the corner. I noticed he had the look of both shock and anticipation on his face. He seemed as if he was frozen in place with his mouth and eyes wide open, and he started rocking back and forth in a side-to-side motion. I noticed the Bigfoot had its hand wrapped around Steve's left ankle. That's when I put my finger to my lips and motioned for him to stay quiet. I quietly made my way toward them. The Bigfoot must have heard me approach because it sat up. When it saw me, it let out a roar and got to its feet. After it stood up and turned toward me, I shot it in the chest and head at point-blank range. After I shot and killed it, that's when I walked over to Steve. I helped him to his feet and we walked back toward the cave opening. You guys know everything else that happened from there? Wow, Jake said. Who knows what would have happened to you guys if the Bigfoot would have been awake? It could have likely killed the both of you. That's highly unlikely because I would have seen it and shot it before it could have gotten to me, Brian said. The inside of the cave was wide open. There wasn't any place for it to hide. You're both lucky, Bo said. Hell, we've all been lucky while we've had to deal with these sons of bitches. I'm just happy this whole ordeal is almost over. Steve finished his second egg salad sandwich and opened a second can of cola when Brian asked Steve, "Are you ready to go home?" "Who's home?" Steve asked. Brian said, "Mine, of course." At that moment, Jake realized Brian and Steve had not introduced themselves. "Steve, this is Brian Youngblood. He's a neighbor that lives on the other side of the river from my grandparents' farm. Bo and I met him and his wife Marissa just the other day when we were searching for you. Brian has been out here helping us try to find you. Bo and I have stayed with him for the past couple of days." Jake glanced at Brian. "Brian, this is Steve." Brian and Steve shook hands. Brian leaned over and gave Steve a big bear hug and said, "Man, I'm happy we finally found you." Steve teared up when the reality of what had happened to him sank in. This made Jake, Brian, and Bo tear up as well. Steve struggled to get to his feet, and he looked at the three of them and said, "I'm ready to go whenever you guys are," his voice stronger. Brian closed the tailgate. Jake helped Steve to the passenger door. Jake looked at Bo. "You can ride up front. I'll ride in the back with Steve." Bo opened the door and Jake helped Steve climb into the back seat. Jake climbed in behind Steve. Bo climbed into the front seat and closed the door. Brian climbed into the driver's seat and started the truck and put it in gear, and they headed back to the cabin. "It'll take about 45 minutes to get back to Brian's cabin," Jake explained to Steve. "From what we figured out, the Bigfoot that kidnapped you took you about 8 miles as the crow flies from the bridge to where we found you. The ride back to Brian's is a little more than 15 miles because we have to take the dirt road that meanders through the mountains. I'm so happy we found you, and you survived this whole ordeal. It was smart to leave pieces of your shirt along the way for Bo and me and then Brian to follow. Your shirt pieces were the main clue that helped lead us to you. A few times while we searched for you, we would run across your sneaker prints in the dirt." "How did you know they were my sneaker prints?" Steve asked. "Because the balls of your sneakers are bare. They don't have any tread on them. I noticed that when me and you first fished at the hole past the swinging bridge. I saw your prints on the sandbar." "I'm glad you noticed that," Steve said. While they were on their way back to Brian and Marissa's cabin, Jake noticed Steve was sleepy. He suspected he would probably sleep a lot since his rescue. He figured since he was no longer in fear for his life, he would feel safe enough to sleep. Jake wrapped his left arm around Steve's shoulders, and Steve laid his head on Jake's shoulder. He fell asleep and slept the rest of the way back to the cabin. When they got there, Brian said, "Wake Steve up and go ahead and help him inside. Bo and me will unload the Bronco." Marissa opened the front door, and she and Jeannie walked out on the porch. Jeannie saw Jake and leaped off the porch and ran over to him and Steve. Jeannie circled around Jake and Steve a few times and then sat down in front of them and looked up at Jake as if to ask, "Aren't you going to introduce us?" "This is Jeannie," Jake said. "She just showed up out of the blue a few days ago at my grandpa's cabin. She's been with us ever since. She's a beautiful and very intelligent dog." Steve bent to pet her, and she kissed him on his face and hands. Then she moved out of the way so Jake could continue to help Steve to the porch. Marissa stood at the top of the porch steps while Steve and Jake made their way over to the porch and said, "Well, you must be Steve. I'm happy to see you." Steve looked up at Marissa and said, "Yes, ma'am." "Well, don't just stand there. Come on inside so we can get you cleaned up. I'll go run a hot bath for you." "You don't have to do that, ma'am," Steve said. "I can just hose off in the yard if that's okay." "Nonsense. I am going to draw you a hot bath and you can sit in it and soak and get cleaned up. I don't want to hear another word about it. And please call me Marissa." "Yes, ma'am. I mean Marissa." "Now that's more like it. It makes me feel like an old woman when you call me ma'am. I am really not that much older than you are." After Jake helped Steve onto the porch, Marissa wrapped her arms around Steve and gave him a big hug. Then she glanced at Jake and said, Help Steve inside while I go upstairs to the bathroom to fill the tub for him." While Jake helped Steve through the doorway, Steve took a look around the great room. "Wow, this place is really nice." "Yeah, it's beautiful, but this is nothing. Wait until you taste her homemade cooking. If her homemade egg salad sandwich is any indication of how well she can cook, then I can't wait." Jake laughed. "Her egg salad sandwiches are good, aren't they?" Jake helped Steve over to the stairway. He let Steve go first and followed close behind him up the stairs in case he got lightheaded and fell down. Marissa waited at the top of the stairs. "Your hot bath is ready. I put a new bar of soap in the soap dish, and there's shampoo and conditioner on the edge of the tub. Take your time and soak in the hot water for a while. There's no reason to be in a big hurry. I also draped a clean towel and washcloth over the side of the tub for you." "Thank you," Steve said. Marissa stepped aside so Jake could continue to help Steve to the bathroom. Once inside the bathroom, Jake helped Steve untie the shirt from around his waist. He helped him step over the side of the tub and get settled into the warm water. Jake said, "I'm gonna go into the bedroom to get you a clean pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt to put on when you're done and bring them back in here and lay them on the commode for you." "Thanks." Jake returned a couple minutes later and laid the sweatpants and t-shirt on top of the closed commode lid. He also laid Steve's toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste on the sink. He said, "I'm gonna go back downstairs, but I'll leave the bathroom door open, so you can yell for me if you need help when you get back out of the tub. Take your time and enjoy your hot bath." Like Marissa said, there's no need to be in a big hurry. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." "Okay," Steve said, "but I doubt when I'm done. I'll need your help." "Okay," Jake said and walked over and partially closed the bathroom door before he headed back downstairs. Jake heard everyone on the front porch talking, so he made his way outside to join them. When he walked out onto the porch, they were discussing sleeping arrangements for the night. Jake noticed Jeannie asleep at Brian's feet. Bo said, "I'll sleep on the couch downstairs and Jake and Steve can share the bed in the spare bedroom." "I don't have a problem with sleeping on the couch either," Jake said. "I should probably let Steve sleep alone in the bed upstairs while I sleep on the couch. He's probably gonna sleep long and hard for a while, and I don't want to disturb him." Marissa said, "What you suggested is probably a good idea." They next discussed how Brian would drive Bo, Steve, and Jake to Bo's house in Buckhannon tomorrow so Steve and Jake could make arrangements to get back home. Bo glanced at Jake. "Do you have any money?"
"No."
"Remember when I mentioned how I lost my wallet after I fell in the river when the bridge collapsed? I lost about $350 in cash and several credit cards along with my driver license." "What about Steve? Does he have any money?" "I don't even think Steve brought his wallet with him. Steve and I decided before we left to come down here that I'd pay for everything. Once we make it back to town, I'll call my parents and have them wire me some money to rent a car so me and Steve can get home." "You won't be able to rent a car without a credit card and driver license," Bo said. "Yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. I'll just loan you and Steve my Mustang to drive home," Bo said. "You can't do that because then you won't have a vehicle," Jake said. "Don't worry about me. I can pick and choose from any number of old clunkers to drive from my dad's shop. I thank you, because I don't see any other way for me and Steve to get back home. As soon as we make it home, I'll have my dad follow me back to Buckhannon so I can return your car. Once I get back home," Jake said while he looked at Brian and Marissa, "I'll send you some money to cover all the expenses and things you two have incurred while Bo and me stayed here with you, and to repay you for your time and the gas you used while you helped me and Bo search for Steve." "Are you kidding me?" Brian said. His arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "Don't insult me there, bud. If you send me any money, I'll just tear up the check. Marissa and I've been more than pleased to help you and Bo out and to search for and finally find Steve. Not only that, together, we've killed 22 of those motherfucking Sasquatches. That means there's now 22 less of those motherfuckers hanging around, here to terrorize Marissa and me. I can't argue with that," Jake said. "Both of you are the two nicest and most generous people that I have ever met. You've risked life and limb to help me find my buddy Steve, while Marissa has kept us fed and clothed the entire time. What more can a stranger ask for?" Jake looked at Bo and said, "That goes for you too, Bo." Brian said, "Stranger? I put you on top of my buddy list, ranking higher than most of my comrades from the military. Jake laughed. Brian said, I consider all of you, Bo, you, and Steve to be my buddies. Thank you, Bo and Jake said as they looked at Brian. Jake heard Steve yell for him. He walked into the house and saw Steve was dressed and standing near the railing upstairs. What's up? I want to lay down and get some sleep. Which bedroom is which? While facing the doors, the one on the right, Jake said. Wake me up when it's time for dinner. Okay, I will. Steve made his way to the bedroom, and Jake went back outside and sat back down. Marissa asked, Do you think Steve will be hungry when he's finished with his bath? Brian, Bo, and Jake laughed. Steve ate 2 egg salad sandwiches and 2 apple fritters before he got back here, Jake said. Not to mention he drank 2 cans of soda and 2 bottles of water. When Steve yelled for me, he told me he wanted to take a nap and asked me to wake him in time for dinner. Marissa said, I can't imagine everything he's been through and had to endure over the past 8 days. I don't want to imagine what he's been through, Jake said. I'm sure he'll probably tell us his side of the story during dinner tonight, though. Marissa said, I don't think I want to hear it. It's gonna be terrible. Aren't you guys hungry? It sounds like Steve ate everything I packed you. Guys, for lunch. Knowing it was about 3 p.m., Jake said, Not really. I can wait until dinner. Brian said, I can wait. Me too, Bo said. Brian asked, Do you guys want a beer? Yeah, I'll take one, Bo said. Me too, Jake said. Brian asked Marissa, Will you please go in the kitchen and fetch us all a beer? Yeah, I guess so. I have to go in and get dinner started anyway, Marissa said. I'm going to make a Yankee pot roast for dinner with all the fixings. That sounds wonderful, Jake said. I think that's one of Steve's favorite meals. Maybe I'll even bake a cake and turn dinner into a celebration, Marissa said. Brian said, That sounds like a good idea. Marissa went back inside and returned a few seconds later and handed a beer to each of them. After I get dinner on the stove, I'll be back out to join you guys. What time do you think dinner will be ready? Jake asked. Remember, Steve asked me to wake him up in time for dinner. Marissa said, It should be ready between 6 o'clock and 6:30 p.m. I'll wake Steve up a little earlier so he'll have time to wake up before dinner. Marissa said, That sounds like a good idea, before she went back inside. Brian, Bo, and Jake sat on the porch and continued to talk. They heard a scream come from the other side of the river on the hillside near Jake's grandfather's cabin. Jake glanced at Bo. I doubt the cabin's still standing. He looked at Brian and said, I wish there was a way to protect it because my grandfather fortified the cabin from the inside, and it protected all of us from the creatures when they attacked us. I think my grandfather built it the way he did was because he and my grandmother had to take refuge in it to escape the creatures sometime in the past. Brian said, Your grandfather could have fortified it for the very reason I put steel bars on my windows and doors. The creatures could have very well tormented your grandparents, and they had to temporarily move into the cabin for protection at some point. They never once mentioned the creatures when they were alive, Jake said. They let me play alone in the woods up behind the barn as a small child. You'd think they would have at least said something. Maybe the reason your grandparents never told you about the creatures is because they thought it would scare you and keep you and your folks from visiting them, Brian said, then took a swig of his beer. Jake said, That definitely makes a lot of sense. That could very well be the reason why my grandparents never mentioned the creatures to my mom and dad and me. It's a shame that we can't lock the cabin up to preserve it. I'd hate to see the creatures destroy it, Brian said. After you guys get home, I'll ford the river when it's low enough and drive my truck up there and see what I can do about it. If the creatures have already ransacked the place, I'll clean the mess up and then secure the door in some way so they can't ever get back inside it. I'll greatly appreciate that because that little cabin has just made its way into history, Jake said. How so? Brian asked. Jake said, Because if I write a story about this whole ordeal sometime, I'm gonna mention how that little log cabin saved Bo's, Steve's, and my lives by protecting us from the Bigfoot when they attacked it. Brian laughed and said, If you write your story and put it into book form and publish it, it'll probably become a bestseller. Jake laughed and said, I doubt that I'll ever do that because I don't think I want to relive the tale. Brian swallowed a sip of his beer. "I don't blame you," Jake said. "Besides that, nobody would believe it anyway. What's gonna happen to your grandparents' farm?" Bo asked. "I mean the house, the barn, and all the other buildings." Jake said, "The house is completely destroyed along with the barn and pig pen. I don't care if they get burned to the ground. You just reminded me. I'll have to get in contact with the owners of the retreat to let them know what happened to their house. I think my mom has their phone number. I think they live in Morgantown." Brian said, "Marissa and me have never met the owners of the retreat. We've never introduced ourselves, and they've never came over here to introduce themselves either, because all the property on the other side of the river is privately owned. I've never really had any reason to cross the river to look around. The only time Marissa and I've ever been over there was to follow the road up through the mountains one time to explore. Besides the one time, I've never really been back across the river," Jake said after he took a swig of beer and coughed. "It's a shame and a waste because the creatures had to destroy my grandparents' property. Maybe sometime in the distant future I can move a double-wide mobile home onto the property, or maybe have a log cabin built like yours in the location of the old barn. The only way I'd even consider it is if I built a 20 feet tall stone fence around it and then electrify the top of it somehow. In addition to that, I'd still install steel bars on all the windows and doors." Bo and Brian laughed. Jake asked, "What time is it?" Brian looked at his watch. "It's 5:38. I'd better get upstairs and wake Steve up for dinner." Jake got up and went back into the house to wake Steve, and Jeannie decided she would follow him. She followed him upstairs and across the loft while he walked over to the bedroom door and knocked on it lightly. Steve didn't answer, so Jake opened the door and he and Jeannie went inside the room. Jeannie jumped on top of the bed and kissed Steve in the face. Steve suddenly sat up and pushed Jeannie off the side of the bed to the floor. He realized where he was and said, "Jeannie, I'm sorry. I thought the creature was messing around with me. Come on back up here so I can pet you." Jeannie jumped back on the bed and Steve pet her. "I'm sorry. Dinner'll be ready in a few minutes. You should probably go ahead and get up so you can wake up a little before we sit down to eat. I'll be down in a few minutes." Jake called Jeannie and they walked downstairs and went back out to the porch. Jeannie went back over to Brian and laid down at his feet. Jake said, "I woke Steve up and he said he'll be down in a few minutes." Jeannie jumped up on the bed and scared him. He shoved her off the bed to the floor. He said he thought the Bigfoot was messing with him. "He didn't hurt her, did he?" Bo asked. Jake said, "No." Once he realized where he was and she wasn't the Bigfoot, he called her back upon the bed and apologized to her and pet her for a few seconds. "She's fine. Steve will probably have nightmares for many, many months, if not for many years about his whole ordeal," Brian said. "He might even have to undergo mental counseling to deal with everything he's been through." "That wouldn't surprise me," Jake said. "I know I'll continue to have nightmares for a long time myself." Bo said, "I know I will." "I probably will too," Brian said. "We'll all probably suffer from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of our lives over this whole thing. I can guarantee you Steve will." Jake said, "You're probably right." Steve appeared in the doorway. "Marissa asked me to tell you guys dinner will be ready in a few minutes, and for you to come inside and get cleaned up before we sit down to eat." They got up and went inside and washed up in the kitchen sink before they went into the dining room to sit down at the table. Marissa had already set the table and placed Steve at the head of it as the guest of honor. Bo and Jake sat in their usual places while Jeannie went underneath the table and laid down in her usual spot. Marissa had already poured everyone a glass of iced tea. Jake took a few sips of his and sat it back down. Marissa carried a huge Dutch oven into the dining room and sat it down on a couple of trivets in the middle of the table. She placed a large serving spoon in the pan and said, "Go ahead and help yourselves. I'll be back in a second with some homemade cornbread." The pot roast smelled delicious as the aroma from the meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, and garlic along with various herbs and spices filled the air. Brian looked at Steve. "Don't be shy. Go ahead and load up your plate." Steve filled his plate and handed Bo the spoon and then began to eat. Bo filled his plate and passed the spoon to Jake, who filled his plate. Marissa walked back into the dining room and handed a plate of cornbread to Steve and then sat down at the table. Jake passed the serving spoon to Marissa. Steve took a couple of pieces of cornbread and placed them on the edge of his plate and passed the cornbread to Bo. Bo took a couple of pieces before he passed the plate to Jake. Marissa and Brian filled their plates with food while Jake and Bo sat and waited. Brian looked at Bo. "Will you do us the honor and say grace again?" Steve put his fork down on his plate. "I'm sorry. I'm hungry and I already started to eat." "No problem," Brian said. "We usually always say grace before we eat around here. That's all." Bo asked everyone to join hands before he said grace. Everyone joined hands and Bo prayed, "Dear Father, we thank you as you protected all of us while we searched for Steve. We're thankful that you brought Steve back to us unharmed and no worse for wear." Steve sighed. "Father, we're thankful that you brought Brian and Marissa into our lives and how they helped us find Steve. We're thankful for the generosity that Brian and Marissa have given us. We ask for your protection as Brian drives me, Jake, and Steve into town tomorrow. We ask you to protect Brian and Marissa while they continue to live here in these monster-infested mountains. We thank you for the wonderful food for which we are about to receive. In Jesus' name, I ask it. Amen." Amen was heard around the table, and everyone began to eat. Jake looked at Steve. "While we're eating, why don't you share your side of the story with us? Tell us what happened." Steve said, "I'd rather not relive it, but you all deserve to know what happened. I'll try to leave most of the gory details out of it though, because we're eating." "Okay, where should I start?" When the bridge collapsed, I fell into the water and got carried downstream. I hurt badly, but I made my way to the opposite side of the river, along the bank not too far downstream from the Bigfoot that caused the bridge to collapse. The last thing I saw was how the Bigfoot scrambled as it tried to get to shore and how it got out of the water a few yards from where I was along the riverbank. I watched the Bigfoot get out of the water and stand on all fours and shake itself off, almost like a wet dog does, and then it looked at me and roared. At that point, I almost passed out. I watched it stand up and make its way over to me. It grabbed me around my waist with its huge hands and heaved me up and over its shoulder. It carried me back upstream to where the bridge used to be and climbed the bank up to the road near Jake's car. It took off across the road and entered into the woods where Jake and I saw it the first time. It carried me halfway up the mountain to a small cave where it put me inside and stood guard at the cave entrance all night long. It screamed several times off and on while it paced back and forth in front of the cave entrance for several hours before it sat down and blocked my escape. When the sun came up the next morning, I heard a different Bigfoot approach through the underbrush. I watched from inside the cave as this other one walked up and stood in front of the one that kidnapped me, and both of them talked to each other in some kind of gibberish language. It sounded like they spoke backwards Japanese. The Bigfoot that kidnapped me moved aside, and this other one yanked me out of the cave and hoisted me over its shoulder and took me down over the riverbank and crossed the river. It made its way up the bank at the sandbar and followed along the tree line toward the lower end of the bottom where it re-entered the woods and carried me off down a trail. I beat my fists on the Bigfoot's back and had to try to get the thing to turn me loose, but that only made it tighten its grip on me. Then it carried me to an open meadow and sat me down on some large rocks at the other side of the meadow and roared at me. It walked over to the other side of the meadow and picked some kind of yellow flowers and laid them on a huge mound of dirt and paused to look at the mound for a few seconds before it came back over to me and roared at me again. "That must have been who put the daffodils on the Bigfoot grave," Jake said. Bo said, "Yeah, we would have only been a few hours behind them on that trail." Anyway, after it roared at me the second time, it made weird hand gestures at me. It seemed like it was trying to tell me it was no use to try to escape. It pointed to the trail and then back at me several times, and then it would shake its head while it poked me in the chest. At this point, they had finished dinner and continued to sit and listen to Steve recount what had happened to him. Marissa looked at Steve. "I need to go back into the kitchen. Will you hold on a minute until I come back before you continue with your story?" "Yeah, go ahead," Steve said. Marissa returned from the kitchen. She carried a homemade yellow cake with chocolate frosting. A lit candle burned in the center of the cake. She took the cake over and sat it on the table next to Steve, and then returned to the kitchen and came back with a knife and 5 saucers and forks to cut and serve the cake. After Marissa walked back into the dining room, Steve blew out the candle and Marissa cut and handed everyone a slice of cake. She cut another slice and put it on a saucer and set it at her place at the table. Marissa looked at Steve. "I baked this cake to celebrate your safe return. Jake mentioned that he thought your favorite meal was pot roast, and since that's what I had planned to serve for dinner tonight anyway, I decided to bake you a cake and turn this into a celebration." Everyone clapped and cheered and told Steve how happy they were that he was there with them safe and sound. Jeannie barked and joined in the festivities. She put her paws on Steve's lap and kissed him on the cheek. Steve gently pushed her back off his lap and asked her to go back and lay down and then said, "Pot roast is my favorite meal, and I really appreciate the cake and everything that you've all done for me. You guys hadn't found me when you did. I'm sure I probably wouldn't have made it for much longer. With that, I owe my life to all of you. I don't know what else to say but thank you." His eyes filled with tears. Brian said, "Now, let's eat our cake while you get back to your story." Steve asked, "Where did I leave off?" "You were talking about the Bigfoot as it gestured to you at the rock formation in the meadow," Jake said. Steve said, Yeah, I remember now. Anyway, the Bigfoot continued to stand there and guard me for a few minutes before it stood me up and gestured that it wanted me to continue down the trail that led away from the rocks. It stood behind me and poked and pushed me down the trail. That's when I got the idea to rip off small pieces of my shirt to throw on the ground and hoped someone would find them and come and look for me. At this point, I wasn't even sure if Jake and Bo had survived the bridge collapse. I just hoped one of them did and would come and search for me sooner or later. When I made it to the fallen tree that crossed the river, the Bigfoot picked me back up and slung me over its shoulders and got down on all fours and bound across the tree and up the riverbank on the other side of the river. It struggled while it carried me up the steep riverbank. It carried me this way for a little while before it set me back down. It poked and prodded me while it forced me to walk in the direction it wanted me to go. Before we entered the trees again on the other side of the White's property, I took off and ran, but the Bigfoot easily caught me, and it knocked me to the ground. It waited for me to get back up and walk again, but I refused to, and that's when it screamed at me and picked me back up and carried me again. It crossed what I thought was a main dirt road on the other side of the White's property and continued along a trail through the woods and carried me up to the top of a mountain. When it reached the top, there was a rock formation that dropped about 1,000 feet or so to the forest floor below. I didn't know what it planned to do with me at this point. I thought it might throw me from the cliff. It put me down and it rested for a few minutes. Then it picked me back up and wrapped me around its shoulders and climbed down the rock face. I had to hold on to handfuls of its hair while it made its way down the ledge. I peed myself at one point on the way down. I thought for sure it would drop me before it made it to the bottom, but it didn't. When the Bigfoot made it to the bottom of the ledge, it put me down again so it could rest. After it rested, it guided me back onto another trail through the woods, and we walked for quite a good distance before it stopped again to rest when we reached another road. It picked me back up and carried me until it came upon a river and put me down on some large rocks next to the river's edge after we crossed the other road. It breathed heavily and was out of breath. It stood there and guarded me for about 20 minutes while it caught its breath. I took the opportunity while it rested to tear several pieces from my shirt to drop along the way. Because of the way it had my arms pinned when it carried me, I couldn't get my arms free to tear pieces from my shirt. When it finally decided it was ready to go again, it walked up to me and slapped me in the middle of my chest with the back of its hand and grunted and pointed to the trail. I got back to my feet, and the Bigfoot followed close behind me while it poked and pushed me along the way. We crossed another dirt road when it picked me back up before it re-entered the trail on the other side of the road. It walked quite a distance down the trail before it stepped off it, and it carried me through the woods to another small cave. It put me in the cave and piled several huge logs in front of the cave opening and left for a little while. Jake asked, "Did you try to move the logs out of the way so you could get away?" Steve said, "I didn't even bother to try because the Bigfoot would have probably tracked me back down. The logs were too heavy and too big to move anyhow. Anyway, the Bigfoot returned about a half hour later and moved the logs out of the way and tossed me a piece of raw bloody meat. I knew the meat was deer meat because it still had the deer hide attached to it. There was no way I was going to eat it, so I threw it on the ground inside the cave. It picked it back up and handed it back to me and gestured for me to eat it. It would point to the meat, and then it would put its dirty fingers up to my lips. It did this several times, and I threw the meat at it, and it growled at me, and then went back outside the cave. It sat down in front of the cave entrance and ate what looked like the whole hind quarter of a deer. Everyone had finished eating their cake, and Marissa got up to clear the table. "Do any of you want some more iced tea?" "How about bringing us a round of beers instead?" Brian said. Marissa looked at Steve. "Wait until I feed Jeannie and put the dishes in the sink, and come back before you continue with your story." "Go on." "I'll wait," Steve said. "I need to use the bathroom anyway." Steve stood up from the table and climbed the stairs to the bathroom. Marissa cleared the table and took everything to the kitchen while Jeannie followed close behind her. Brian, Jake, and Bo continued to sit at the table and talk among themselves about what Steve had told them thus far. A few minutes later, Steve came back to the table and sat down. Marissa came back into the dining room a couple of minutes later with 5 cans of beer. She handed a beer to everyone and sat down and opened one for herself. Steve continued. The Bigfoot put the logs back into place in front of the cave entrance and disappeared again for a few minutes. Came back and moved the logs out of the way. It entered the cave carrying a leaf from an umbrella tree that it had rolled into a container that was full of water. It handed me the water and gestured for me to drink it. I suspected the water was from the river and knew I would probably get sick if I drank it. I was thirsty and drank it anyway. The Bigfoot seemed pleased that I drank it and then went back outside and sat down in front of the cave entrance. I was inside the cave for quite some time before it started to get dark. Before it got completely dark, the Bigfoot crawled back into the cave with me and laid down. It slept on its back and wrapped its hand around my right ankle and held onto it all night while it slept. I tried to pry its fingers loose from around my ankle, but every time I would try, it would open its eyes and look at me and grunt. I stayed awake all night while I sat in the cave and tried to plan my escape. Brian asked, "Did you come up with an escape plan?" Steve said, "I thought I'd just pry the Bigfoot's fingers loose from around my ankle and make a run for it. Then I thought better of it because I was so sore after I fell in the river, and stiff because I had sat for so long that I knew if I tried to run away I wouldn't get very far before it would easily catch me. In addition, I had no idea where I was and where I could escape to and not get lost. Anyway, my stomach started to cramp badly, and I knew that was because of the water I drank earlier. I didn't have any other choice but to sit there and shit my pants. The smell was awful. My shit smelled worse than the Bigfoot did. I vomited about an hour or so later and did it a few feet from where I sat. The combination from the smell of the Bigfoot, my shitty pants, and the vomit overwhelmed me so bad I nearly passed out. The next morning, the Bigfoot awakened and dragged me out of the cave. It slung me over its shoulder and headed back to the main game trail. It put me down to walk a couple of times. At one point along the trail, it stopped to rest and I sat down on an old rotten log. That's where I picked up a stick and wrote a message on the top of the log and laid a piece of my shirt on top of it so someone would see it. Jake said, "We found your message." Steve said, "Me and the Bigfoot crossed a road 2 more times and continued on the trail until we reached a large briar thicket. It picked me up and climbed up into the trees to get to the other side of the thicket and then put me back down again. It nearly dropped me at one point, but grabbed me just before I started to fall. That's the thicket we had to crawl into, and then walk to the other end and crouch down to walk back out of," Bo said. Brian and Jake nodded. Steve said, "The Bigfoot forced me on down the trail until we came to a small brook that led to a canyon opening. We followed yours and the Bigfoot's footprints in the mud alongside the brook," Brian said. "At that point, I knew for sure the Bigfoot took you to that canyon, but you had already left by the time we got there." Steve said, "The Bigfoot forced me into the canyon and guarded the entrance from the inside. I saw the brook that ran through the middle of it and was dying of thirst and walked over to it and cupped my hands and drank a few handfuls of water from it. I knew it would make me sick, but I didn't care because I was already sick. I crawled into the biggest cave at the back of the canyon, and this is where I stayed for the rest of that day and night and all of the next day. Did you guys find the note I left inside the cave?" "We sure did," Jake said. "Your note made it look like you had given up all hope." Steve said, I pretty much did give up at that point. I continued to drink from the brook, and I had to take my jeans and what was left of my shirt off. I hurt so badly from being dragged through the briars and branches and through the woods that I covered the gash in my leg and my cuts and scratches with mud to help alleviate the pain. The Bigfoot brought me some more raw and bloody meat, but like before, I couldn't bring myself to eat it even though I was starving. Jake said, "When we found the note you had written in the mud inside the cave along with the rest of your shirt, your jeans weren't there. What happened to your jeans?" Steve said, "They smelled so bad I threw them out of the cave. From there, I don't know what happened to them. Maybe the Bigfoot carried them off somewhere," Brian said. Steve said, "Who knows?" Anyway, at some point after it got dark, the Bigfoot picked me up and carried me up and over the side of the canyon and put me into the cave you found me in at the top of the mountain. It brought me raw meat, but I still refused to eat it. I was more afraid I would die of thirst because there was no water source around. The Bigfoot would carry an umbrella leaf full of water to me a couple times a day. I would drink the water because I knew that's what was keeping me alive. It was only about a quarter cup each time. The Bigfoot and me had been in that cave for about 2 days. I heard several shots that were fired quite a distance away the day before you guys showed up. Jake said, "We searched the other mountain the day before and killed 6 creatures that tried to kill us." Steve said, "I didn't know what was going on. I waited, but no one came until the next morning. I was surprised to hear people whispering outside the cave entrance. I saw the flashlight beam and heard someone come inside the cave. The Bigfoot lay there asleep when Brian entered the cave, and it had its hand around my ankle so I couldn't escape. It sat up and roared at Brian. Then it stood up, and that's when Brian shot and killed that son of a bitch. That's it. You know how the rest of my story goes." They all hung on Steve's every word as he recounted his tale. Everyone let out a deep breath when he finished his account of what had transpired between him and the creatures over the past 8 days. Jake looked at the clock that hung in the kitchen, and it told him that it was well past his bedtime. They sat and listened to Steve tell his story for more than 4 solid hours. A few times during Steve's account, Jake glanced across the table at Marissa and noticed that she had tears in her eyes. Before Jake stood up to go out to the porch for one last smoke, before he headed off to bed, he said to Steve, "We've already worked out the sleeping arrangements for tonight. You can have the bed in the spare room, and me and Bo will sleep on the couches in the great room." "I don't care about sharing the bed with you," Steve said. Jake said, "You need to get some good sleep after all that you've been through. I don't have a problem sleeping on the couch." "You need your sleep," Bo said. "I don't mind sleeping on the couch either." Jake got up and excused himself from the table and headed to the front door. He called Jeannie so that she could go and do her business one last time before bed. He turned the porch light on before he opened the front door. He opened the screen door and Jeannie ran out the door and down off the porch. He walked over to his chair and sat down and lit up a cigarette. Jeannie came back upon the porch a few minutes later and laid down at his feet. She yawned a few times and then fell asleep. When he finished his smoke, he flicked the butt out into the yard. He woke Jeannie up and asked her to follow him back into the cabin. Jeannie and Jake made it back inside, and he closed the door and turned the porch light off. Jake noticed Marissa as she came down the stairs carrying 2 pillows and blankets. Marissa said, "Steve has already gone to bed." On her way down the stairs, once she reached the bottom of the stairs, she handed the blankets and pillows to Jake. "Thank you," Jake said. Jake made his way to the couch on the wall where the shadow box of arrowheads and spearheads hung. He placed his blanket and pillow on that couch and then placed the others on the couch that sat to the left of the front door for Bo. He could still hear Bo and Brian talk in the dining room. He heard Bo tell Brian that he needed to head off to bed as he laid down on the couch and covered up and got settled for the night. Bo came into the living room and Jake watched as he made up his couch and laid down. Jake drifted off to sleep shortly thereafter. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.